What's up, everybody? Zach here from Zaxternaut Glass, here for my second installment in what I think I'm going to be calling What's Melting. So today I'm going to be doing an implosion pendant. This is going to be a dot pattern with a couple colors. We're going to be using this blank and puffing out a bit of a bubble, so we have a thinner bit of glass on the end to start our pattern. The first installment was a bit rough, and I'm excited to document the process a little bit more in full this time. So there you see I kind of heated up the end of the tube, waited for it to be like an even temperature, and puffed into it after like a little bit of time out of the flame. So I think I'm doing that for a second time here. And then I start to puff around now. You see it expand a little bit there. So here we've got the couple of colors I'm going to be using today. That's Karmaline and Galaxy. So starting with Galaxy, this is a sparkly black from Northstar Glass. Karmaline's a pink, kind of like semi-transparent to translucent, gold-based pink color. So I aimed for the very middle of that bubble there because the pattern I'm about to make is kind of like a six-pointed pattern. So I end up using that center dot to place my next preceding circle of dots, which will be 6 of them. You see I put them opposing each other to begin with, so that I can kind of evenly space things. I try and get exactly opposite the first surrounding piece, and then I can kind of divide a little bit more evenly after that. So slow in the flame, kind of heating up the end of that rod, and then dabbing once the surface is hot enough to leave the amount of glass that I want. This is kind of like a timing thing. You just judge the heat and timing on the end of the rod, and you should be able to lay down even sized dots. And there we go. The first 7 dots are down, starting with Galaxy and then back to Karmaline. We'll alternate. So now this second row of dots surrounding the center point is going to begin with dots exactly or as close to exactly in between each of the pink dots from before that. And now I'll switch back to Karmaline and once again dividing each of those black dots, I'll go in between them. So since this is a relatively repetitive process, I've started to actually speed up the footage a little bit. Right now it's going at double time. I have been thinking about potentially posting some of this stuff in kind of like full, unedited, long format with no speed adjustments whatsoever. That could potentially be a little bit more useful to people wanting to judge exactly how long some of these steps take and how much heat I'm giving the whole piece and how much time I'm spending in the flame once I'm actually condensing the whole thing and melting in all these dots. But let me know in the comments if you would like some long format uploads where I don't do any of those edits. And I was thinking about posting those with some maybe some music in the background, just to not have to like do this process while I explain each step. Right now, as you can see, I'm putting some more heat back into those initial dots that I put down. It's important to go back and warm up the pattern every so often. There's quite a bit of stress left in the glass when you haven't melted it all in. So if you take too long to get back to warming up the whole piece again, the pattern can often crack, and sometimes it's really hard to melt the whole thing in. Not impossible, but it's hard to melt it back in without some evidence of the crack. Sometimes you're lucky and you can save it, but it's not always the case. Yeah, making sure everything stays warm while you work further and further down the edge of that bubble is important, because that center point, it can hold a lot of stress. But moving forward, the pattern I'm kind of creating, there's a bit of a star shape to it. So like I said, I put the 6 dots around the center point and then start organizing dots around that. And as you can see, it's starting to like organize into a bit of a triangular pattern around each one of the initial 6 dots. So I just go back and forth and I get this kind of repeating black to pink to black to pink pattern with a bit of a star shape as a whole bunch of dots. And there you go. Back to heating up the bubble, keeping everything warm. And I think since we've been speeding this up, and I've done this a few times, I'm going to actually get this clip here up to 4 times speed and scrub through this a little faster. I did run out of the thinner rod of Karmaline that I had pulled down, so I did have to grab another chunk of it off of my workbench. So the size of that rod changed from the earlier one that I was dotting the bubble with. And I think that's the last of the bubbles or dots I was going to do. And now we're just going to get to melting the whole thing in. I do believe I slowed this down so you can kind of see exactly how long this part takes. I did want to, be able to give you an accurate idea of from the time I started heating that bubble to when I start to puff into it. So I'm about to give it the first blow, and it'll expand the end of the bubble. You can see the dots kind of becoming a little bit more stretched at the edges, and you kind of pause and puff and pause and puff, and it helps really elongate the thicker edge on that bubble where each dot meets the clear glass, and that helps to even out the wall. And the sooner you can even out the wall, the sooner the bubble will condense really evenly. So you give it a nice heat the whole way across, trying to get every dot as evenly heated as possible. As you can see, there's still little bumps, puff, 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 and then straight back into the flame, because the more time you spend out of the flame, the more heat you lose, and the more time you have to spend heating things up again. So once this is all condensed down as far as I want, I'm gonna start to use gravity to pull the pattern back into the tube. So I get that center point hot so that it'll be the thickest part, and then I heat around it and then back to heating the center point to kind of tell the glass where to go. If you heat where the glass you want to move and then the spot you want it to go, you can kind of direct the flow. There you can see as I use the paddle there to flatten the back of the pattern, you can start to see the implosion pattern form inside the tube. I really use that paddle to kind of keep the bottom as even as possible so that it doesn't wave and move back and forth and wobble in the flame, so that you get an even amount of heat at each part of the pattern. If you've got the pattern off kilter on the end of that tube, you'll start to get glass condensing a little faster on one side than the other, and you end up with a little bit of a wavy kind of disc at the end. So there I'm kind of out of the camera angle there. I'm gonna try and do my best to keep everything in frame in the future, but there's a few steps that I end up not quite being in view. Just kind of learning how to film these tutorials at the moment. So like I said before, if you can get in the comments and give me any kind of feedback on maybe some camera angles you'd like to see, something like that. Yeah, just any format that you'd like to see on camera. I'm open to experimenting on new things and documenting this as best I can. So there you can see I'm handling up to the backside of the pattern. And this is what we call a cold seal. I got it, both pieces of glass pretty hot, but the pendant itself, the pattern, was a little cooler. And just as the surface of the glass on the end of that rod is starting to stop glowing is when I push the piece together. So the glass on the inside is still relatively orange, and then you press them together and they'll hold on without actually fusing. So now this is one of the most critical steps in the process. I'm heating that band. I'm like a bit more of a pinpoint or narrow flame, and I'm just getting the shoulder there, and I'm gonna puff into that tube and thin the glass to a bit of a membrane so I can continue to stretch the connection point of that pattern and the rest of the tube. Things get a little bit wobbly here, but it doesn't quite matter because I'm just stretching that glass away. I'm just trying to peel away as much glass as I can, puffing again, just increasing that thin membrane, and then I pop a little hole here and I'll tear that away. So that lip of glass, I was stretching that to thin out as much of that glass as I could so I didn't have a huge amount of glass to swipe away here. So I'll heat that little shoulder of glass that was left from the tube until it kind of condenses, but I won't allow it to condense into the puck of glass that I'm wanting to keep. And then I, in the flame with the rod, start to swipe that away. This is a process that if you aren't very good at it, the only way to get better is practice. The more times you do this, the more even the edge of the glass piece that you'll be finished with will be. There's always a little bit of a heavy spot left right where you pick the last of it away. Like you kind of drag glass to where your rod goes, and then you leave a little bit on, and then you have to go back in and pick that last little bump away. Kind of just rotating the piece and looking at the edges, trying to judge which edge has the most glass, and trying to stop before you start to actually deform your pattern. You don't want to start to swipe away the end of any of those dots. And there we have it. Most of the way. There's a couple little waves, but nothing that can't be melted in and kind of evened out without any more swiping. So I'm going to get in right on that shoulder and start to angle that piece upwards. You see my hand drop down a little bit, and that's to allow that glass to fall away from the center of the pattern so that it'll kind of move from the face of the pendant to the backside, actually. See, it's evening out nicely, and you're ending up with a more even disc. Now you can see that dot pattern in the piece. Now I think it's time for me to pick up another rod and switch sides. So the reason you switch sides is to condense the backside of the pattern. So I'll actually do a relatively hot seal this time. So unlike the backside where I did that cold seal, I'm going to want to crack that one away. This one I'm going to be doing a little bit more heating, and the handle would fuse to the face of the pendant anyways. So at this point I'll just give it a relatively warm handle, and it won't have too much stress. It shouldn't pop off. It's a point where you don't really want the piece to drop off the end of your handle onto the workbench, because you're going to get it hot enough to really move some glass. I'm just evening the piece out. Since I switched sides, I just want to make sure that pendant's rotating in a very straight way on the end of that handle. like I said earlier, any amount of wobble, if your handle is not kind of centered and straight, the pendant will wobble in the flame, and that side will collect, or one side will collect more glass than the other. So now I'm just going to go into heating the whole back side of the piece. I really want to try and set a even heat base into most of the massive glass right now, because I'm going to try and warm things up and move the back side of that edge towards the center of the back of the pendant. This will allow me to condense all those dots where they went into the clear glass and bring them to a termination point. So I use heat and gravity, and that'll let me heat the shoulder and then kind of move the flame towards the center of the pendant in the back and direct the flow of glass towards that point. You'll see me pick up the paddle pretty often now. This is just to make sure that things don't condense too much from the edge while not moving to the center. You can kind of end up with a bit of a divot in the center, and the more of a dent that spot is, the harder it is to kind of condense all these dots evenly. Every so often I'll reach in there with a rod and actually stretch it out before I finish the termination. Yeah, there you can see that pattern really starting to form. These dot patterns really start to come together at this point. Doing implosion pendants was one of the first things that really kind of captivated me when I started blowing glass. It's a really interesting process, watching all those dots go from being on the outside of a tube, melting in, and then flowering out inside this piece as you melt it in and condense it and press it and push it into the push on the backside and flatten things out. See, here I go, like kind of wiggling that handle that I just attached to the back. I'm gonna use that to I think I actually switch axis right here. So I don't always switch like this, but I started to notice that the front side of that pendant could actually elongate a little bit more, so I switched back to a handle on that side. And also sometimes switching to a handle on this side of the pendant will allow you to use gravity to remove that divot that I was talking about before as well. But I think I got that handle on there pretty unevenly this time, so I was very careful to bob the pendant in the flame without rotating too much, because it would have became uneven very quickly. But I just wanted to round out the face of that piece a little bit more. So yeah, not always a necessary point to switch handles, but sometimes to make things even, you have to go back a step. Now I'm just picking away the last of that rod that I used to hold that pattern. And that way I can go back to condensing the shoulder of that pendant and getting all those dots to that termination point. This part of the process is really just a repetitive kind of get that edge hot right on the backside shoulder of the piece. You want to warm up that glass and let it droop towards the center. So I'll often rotate with the front side of the pendant actually moving upwards in the flame. So the hottest glass is traveling up. So then it wants to drop back down with gravity to condense that pattern. You can actually reverse that and hold it in the opposite direction to flatten out the back a little bit. It helps you avoid that divot that can be created. There's a few steps of the way that you have to avoid that. There you could see the little pattern that's gotten to a point where it's about a 1/2 inch across instead of like 1.5 inches across. And there I grab that rod. I'm going to heat this up so that I can handle up to those dots and pull them away. There I go, flattening the edge of that, or the end of that rod. It's actually more to chill it a little bit than anything, so that it's a little bit more stiffer and I can use it to drag that hot glass on the backside of that piece away. So right here, trying to get right in the center and avoid trapping a bubble on the end of that rod, and then stretching the backside out. So it stretched fairly well, and now I'm gonna cut that handle away. Sometimes you can do the whole step of terminating the pendant in that one part of the process, but I hadn't condensed the pattern to a point where that was quite possible yet. So I rolled that against the corner of my L-marver on my torch just to kind of make a constriction point where I could more easily separate and section down the glass that I wanted to pull away. So just using the tweezers to pick that away and being careful to move a little further back in the flame so as to not boil the termination point. When you got that little thin tail of glass, it can be easy to end up with a bit of boiled glass if you're too close to the torch face as you do that step. So there you can see it's starting to flatten out, and I'm picking a little more glass away because the backside of the pendant's a little bit more dome-shaped than I'd like. And the flatter it is, the easier it'll be to use my paddle to finish flattening the backside of it. Just as you see here, just pushing the termination point in a little bit. I think I might pick a little more away. And I switched to a glass rod to pick the last bit of the termination away. It's easier to grab onto a tinier point and not deform the back of the pattern. A lot of the heat base that you're trying to set into the backside of the pendant as well, you're avoiding pressing too hard while the piece is still too hot. The goal here is to not mash the pattern. If the surface of the glass is hot enough to kind of include the backside of those dots, if you push too hard while the glass is really hot, you can totally deform your pattern, and it kind of makes this weird wave. But now I've got that termination point. I'm just picking that glass off the end of that rod so we have clean glass to do a quick cold seal here. Careful not to handle up with boiled scuzzy glass. You can leave a bunch of extra behind on the pendant if you do. So yeah, a clean handle for these little punties at the end is super important, because I'd really rather not try to have to, pick that termination point again. So there I am heating up that little nipple of glass left from the other rod, and I'm just pulling it away with the tweezers, which should be enough right now. Then just getting in there on the torch and melting that little point in so that it rounds out evenly, and you've got a nice dome-shaped kind of lens on the surface of the glass. So there I picked up that rod of Galaxy, and I'm just going to heat up the end. I think I'm looking at the pattern at the same time, trying to decide where I want to place that rod. It's going to become the bail to attach to a necklace. So there we go, and I'm turning it, looking, trying to make sure I have that handle on, or the bail on, nice and straight. And there you can see that pattern. I'll melt in that punty mark from the handle that I just cracked away. And I'll take the same handle and do another cold seal to the bottom. And this is going to let me work in that rod of color that I'm turning into the loop for the bail. I really want to get that connection point where the black meets the clear, melted in fully. Any acute angles here when you're finished the piece can really allow it to break if it bumps on anything. So you want like a little tiny at the connection point. Think about it as a quarter pipe. Like you want this little transition to have a nice curve to it, because acute angles hold stress. There, I did pull the rod away. Then we've got the glass I want. And I'll let that droop at the connection point. I heat it up real quick, and then I dip the glass I have there in the torch a few times, get it relatively hot, but not too hot, and then fold it over with my tweezers. Gave it a little push there, trying to close that gap where the connection point will be. And I just touch the glass together, and then I start to work that in. I've got my pointed reamer, just gonna work out any acute angle where that connection point was made. Then I kind of focus my heat, try not to let that flop around too much, so you're trying not to get it too hot, but you definitely want to get it hot enough to work it all the way in. I use my paddle there to flatten it against the Elmarver. Then I've got my jacks. They're a little bit easier for expanding the hole when it's closing up a little bit. And then back to the octagonal reamer. Once again, this is one of those things I'm going to try better to keep in the frame in future uploads, but for now, and like right there you saw me looking, you can't see my head, but I was looking straight down from the top of the piece and twisting a little bit to straighten out that loop, because I don't want it to be crooked at all. Straightening out again, just like I said, staring straight down from the top. And there we have it, all finished. Good termination point on the backside. I really love Galaxy. It's nice sparkly black, and Karmaline always super popular color. I really enjoy working with it. They'll really do contrast each other pretty well. Now I'm just polishing that punty mark off the bottom, and then I'll get another clip of this thing out of the kiln when I'm finished with it tomorrow. All right, so out of the kiln, and the sun was shining, so I got this in front of the window. It's nice implosion. Really love the colors here. And you can see that nice termination on the back. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. Like, comment, and subscribe. More stuff like this coming. Thanks for watching.